going to get started and people will come in, come in. So welcome and thank you for joining Women's Way for Closing the Gender Wealth Gap Forum, Equity and Grant Making. I'm Diane Corman-Levy, the Executive Director of Women's Way, and I'm delighted that you all decided to join us this evening for the next 90 minutes or so. By choosing to be with us, when I know you're invited to so many virtual meetings and events, you are choosing to join the movement to promote economic equity and justice and improve gender equity for all women. Today's forum is part of a year-long series whose purpose is to educate different stakeholders about the drivers of the gender and racial wealth gap and actionable steps each of us could take to help close the gender and racial wealth gap. Since October, we have conducted 5 sessions which address strengthening the early childhood education sector, investing in women-owned businesses, gender and racial disparities in healthcare, increasing access to affordable housing, and improving financial capability of women. Today's session, which I'm really looking forward to, focuses on equity and grant making. How can we really change philanthropy so that it is more equitable in its practices and policies and addresses the root and systemic causes of the gender and racial wealth gap? You will hear from 3 amazing speakers who will address this issue from a funder and grantee perspective. You will also have opportunities to ask questions to the speakers via the Q&A button located at the bottom of your screen. We will do our best to address as many of your questions as possible. We are also recording the session and we'll make it available for you to view again in case you want to watch it twice, and for those who could not attend today's session. So before I introduce our amazing panelists and moderator, I would like to first thank our sponsor for the session, which is Permit Capital Advisors, whose support helps us make these sessions possible. And now I'm just going to spend 10 minutes providing an overview of the economic state of women and children, which I know you all have been hearing a lot about, especially since the pandemic, and why Women's Way is investing its resources in addressing the gender wealth gap, particularly at the intersection of gender and race. Just real briefly, for those who don't know Women's Way, we're the leading nonprofit organization dedicated to the advancement of women and girls and gender equity. We were the first umbrella funding federation in the United States specifically dedicated to women's issues. So we've been around for way too long, frankly, because we're still fighting the fight to achieve gender equity for all women. And before COVID, the economic state of women really wasn't that great. Even before all this happened, nationally, women and children were 73% of the poor. Philadelphia had the highest poverty rate at just above 25% among the 10 largest cities, and the largest demographic group living in poverty were women ages 25 to 34. And we know when women are poor, children are poor, and over 37% of children were poor. This was before the pandemic. So what's happened since the pandemic, and I know we've been bombarded with data and news, but 2.5 million women lost their jobs or dropped out of the workforce. Still, nearly 2 million remain unemployed. In April of 2021, all job gains went to men. And at a point when women were really, there was more women in the workforce before the pandemic, the workforce participation rates for women hit 30-year lows because of COVID. And some of the driving factors, as I think probably a lot of you have heard, women account for 74% of employment in high contact occupations that were disproportionately impacted by COVID. We've been hearing a lot about the lack of childcare infrastructure in this country. We have one of the worst in terms of progressive countries, and a lot of women chose to drop out of the workforce because they just didn't have appropriate childcare or access to affordable childcare, and also lack of family-forward workplace policies. And then lower paying jobs without benefits and paid family medical leave are dominated by women. Frankly, this is a statement. Some women said, I actually make more money on unemployment than I do working full time in these sectors, because often the sectors that are dominated by women are underpaid and undervalued. And so, if the conditions for families don't improve, and if we don't see increases of maternal labor force participation, this could, and it lasts beyond the pandemic, it could lead to lost wages would amount to over $64 billion per year. So, it has a huge effect on our economy. So what is the gender wealth gap? This was before the pandemic. At median, single white women own 32 cents on the dollar compared to single white men. Now, this is the wealth gap. I mean, we've been talking a lot about the income pay gap, but more importantly, the wealth gap is even worse. Black and Latinx women own less than a penny, and this has not improved for the past 50 years. In fact, it's actually gotten worse, particularly with the pandemic. And what are some of the causes? Well, women earn less than men, not because they're less capable, not because they they work less hard, not because, one is because of occupational segregation, fields dominated by women. They earn less money, they're less valued, they get paid less. And also women are the primary caregivers. So they still are the ones who have to drop out of the workforce to take care of their children. They're more likely to be denied mortgages and loans or to be overcharged, even though they have a better record of paying back loans. But this is, again, grounded in a lot of racist and sexist biases. They're more vulnerable to predatory lending. They also hold more debt, including 2/3 of all student debt. More women, particularly women of color, are graduating from college than men and white people, but yet they hold 2/3 of all student debt. I mentioned occupational segregation. They provide the majority of unpaid caregiving. And then again, predatory lending coupled with poor financial literacy is one of the causes of the gender wealth gap. And why build wealth? And I think one of the goals for Women's Way is to go from an anti-poverty to an asset building, wealth building model, because assets really enable women to remain stable through financial emergencies. So COVID really highlighted that, right? Women were already economically insecure, many of them. And then when COVID hit, it just unstable. It created a huge havoc for women and their families. It enables women to maintain good health, improve children's opportunities, live with housing security. When you have assets, you can take more risks that result in better jobs or business startups. You're able to pursue a high education for themselves and their children. They can retire securely. 85% of people who are poor in retirement are women. They can pass on security to the next generation, and they can participate and shape political and social agendas. So it has a huge amount of benefits in terms of why we should be building assets. And why invest in women? I talked a little bit about this before, but it's really smart economics to invest in women. The return on your investment is great, partly because when you advance women, you make advances in our region and nation. Women comprise more than half of all workers. This was before the pandemic. This has changed, but they still, I think it's a little under 50%. It's starting to increase, but it's very slow. Nearly half of mothers are the primary breadwinners for their families, and women drive 70 to 80% of all consumer purchasing. So, investing in women is going to have a great return on their family, on our economy, both local and nationally. The second bullet, parental assets are the strongest predictors of children attending and graduating from college. So when people say, I want to invest in children's education, invest in the caregiver, primary caregiver, invest in the mothers. It has a huge impact. And then closing the gender wealth gap would result in an overall GDP gain of over $4 trillion or over $13,000 per person by 2025. So again, empowering women is smart economics. Yet, nonprofits focusing on women and girls receive just 1.6 of all charitable giving. Now, I have 2 dogs. I love dogs, but organizations that provide support for animals get more money than organizations focusing on women and girls. And organizations led by women of color receive less than 1% of all philanthropic dollars. Some inequities going on here. So where's the money? So this is some research that was done recently of the 110 largest foundations in the region. They collectively have over $30 billion in assets. Now, as we know, foundations are required to distribute at least 5% of their endowments, which to me still seems very small, but that's the requirement. But in this 5%, they can include money from donor advised funds. So they can actually, some foundations transfer some of their 5% to donor advised funds as part of their legally required 5% payout minimum. And I don't know if you know this, but there's no legal obligations to ever spend out donor advised funds. So you can shift some of this 5% into donor advised funds and continue to accumulate more wealth and assets for these foundations because there's no requirement to ever spend out, but they can continue to earn interest on that. Also, they can count money they spend, the 5%, on executive salaries and travel expenses of family members towards their 5% payout minimum. So we did some more research. In 2019 in the region, amounts spent on salaries to support people in the philanthropic sector was approximately 62% of money distributed in grants, The average executive pay was over $2 million, and average spent for support staff salary was over $360,000. If you look at it nationally, in terms of the philanthropic system, foundations have assets of $500 billion. They give around $33.6 billion annually. There are over 837,000 nonprofits, excluding religious organizations. Right? So there's a lot of money going out. Great, right? But in spite of this growth, social and economic inequality has worsened. 20% of the US population owns 91% of the net financial wealth. 80% owns 9% of the remaining financial wealth. So there's a lot of money being moved through the philanthropic sector, yet social and economic inequality has not only has it not really improved, it's actually worsened. So Douty, who's a very outspoken person about this, said, philanthropy has been talking about equity, undoing racism, supporting marginalized communities, et cetera, for decades. When is it going to walk its talk? Now, we are going to talk about some of the challenges, and there's also some amazing people doing amazing work to try to transform philanthropy to address these inequities. So there's lots of good stuff going on. I don't mean to be doom and gloom, but I do want to paint a picture of what the philanthropic sector looks like. So we started something called the Women's Economic Security Initiative, and the whole purpose is to help close the gender wealth gap. And it really is a long-term systems level collaborative initiative centered around the vision that all women in the Philadelphia region will attain financial well-being for themselves and their families. So it's a long-term vision, long-term strategies. It's about fostering systems level learning and change with our partners and breaking down silos across organizations and sectors, because we know that the nonprofit sector alone can't address this, that philanthropic sector alone can't address this, that the business sector alone can't. We have to break down silos and work together to address this very complicated issue. And so we built a network of 82 active WESI members representing over 50 organizations. And as I said, they represent for-profit, nonprofit, philanthropic, and public sectors. And really important, women with lived experience of economic insecurity have been at the table from the very beginning, helping co-design strategies to help close the gender and racial wealth gap. We just officially transitioned WESI to the Gender Wealth Institute. We had our birthing on September 20th after 4 years of doing this work. And the mission is really to close the gender wealth gap in the greater Philadelphia area by advancing research and practical solutions that build wealth for women who are economically insecure. And we do this in 3 ways. We're really building a learning community of stakeholders that represent multiple sectors to learn together, share resources, and co-create wealth-building practices. We do not come up with strategies, Women's Way. We are the convener, we facilitate the learning. It comes from all the partners. We also test and scale promising practices that build wealth for low wealth women and to help close the gender wealth gap. And we work to influence folks to have a better understanding of what the drivers of the gender wealth gap is, and also how to close the gender wealth gap through things like this forum today. We're also doing a lot of research, sharing publications, reports, and also using storytelling and centering the voices of women with lived experiences to help kind of support policies that work towards closing the gender wealth gap. So enough of me. I'm so happy to introduce our 3 amazing panelists and moderator. I want to start with Farrah Parks, who I know a lot of people know in the region. Farrah Parks' almost 20 years of experience in the nonprofit sector has spanned a range of issues, including community development, HIV prevention, early childhood education, workforce development, digital literacy, and adult education. However, gender equity has always been her personal passion. She served on the boards of Local Abortion Access Fund, the Women's Medical Fund, and the Valentine Foundation, which supports social change for women and girls. She has been Gender Justice Fund's Executive Director since June of 2019, and also serves on the Board of Directors of Bread and Roses Community Fund. Ms. Parks holds a master's degree in public affairs from the Policy School of Princeton University, where she also earned a graduate certificate in health policy. Welcome, Farrah. So glad you're here. Jennifer Leith, so welcome, has worked in the greater Philadelphia nonprofit sector for nearly 20 years, addressing issues of economic, social, and gender justice. She's an avid proponent of socially responsible investing and its power to build just and sustainable communities through collective action. She's currently the executive director of the Douty Foundation and serves on the Hartford Township Human Relations Commission, and the township's Ad Hoc Solar Committee. She recently finished a 6-year term on the board of directors of the Women's Opportunity Resource Center and its sister organization, the Economic Opportunities Fund. Jen holds a master's degree in history from Rutgers University and a bachelor's degree in history and political science from Bucknell. Welcome, Jen. And then Alicia Gonzalez, who we've been working with for many years, is a queer Latinx who holds master's degrees in social work and human sexuality education. She is the executive director for Women's Medical Fund, an organization that since 1985 has worked to ensure and expand abortion access now and always through direct service and community organizing. And Alicia, man, we need your organization more than ever, unfortunately, right now. Alicia formerly served as executive director of GALE, a queer Latinx social justice organization, and adjunct professor for Winers University Center for Human Sexuality Studies. Alicia serves on the Bread and Roses Community Fund Board and is co-founder of Sex Interactive Collective and is a member of the newly formed Philly Pride Collective. Welcome, Alicia. So glad to have you. And finally, our moderator, Shira Hodges, is the interim president of Philanthropy Network, Greater Philadelphia, a 120-member organization. Philanthropy Network supports funders and social investors in Greater Philadelphia as a hub for learning, knowledge sharing, and partnership. Philanthropy Network cultivates, I'm going to stop sharing my slides, cultivates opportunities for funders and others to learn, connect, and lead social change. Previously, I've learned more about you, Shira, just recently. She was an international philanthropic consultant. Love to hear more about that. Shira managed a range of projects, including the design, launch, and scaling of work in South India for the Freedom Fund, the world's first private multi-million-dollar fund created to fight modern-day slavery. Love to hear more about that someday. Shira also had disaster relief efforts internationally. She received her master's degree in public health with a concentration in community-oriented primary care from the George Washington University. She holds a bachelor's degree in international studies and public policy from the University of Denver. And in 2020, she participated in the Gender Justice Giving Project at Bread and Roses. You can see a lot of people involved in Bread and Roses. So I'm going to shut up and I'm going to hand it over to Shira and have this engaging, lively conversation. Thank you all for being here.
Thanks, Diane. Good afternoon, everyone. Wow, I am honored to be here among such phenomenal women and really excited to get to know more about what each of your work is and some of your perspectives. So Diane, thank you for the presentation on why women's health matters and providing that perspective on philanthropy in relation to gender and racial equity. I think that was like a great start to really level set us. During this segment, I'll ask the panelists questions for about 30 minutes. Then I'm going to open it up to all of you to ask questions. So please feel free to, as you think of them, put your questions in the chat and we'll make sure to get to them. So after you have a chance to ask questions, I'll also circle back to the panelists for some of their closing thoughts. So I also just want to make sure that, everyone is really coming engaged, and as you are in the moment right now. If it's possible, try to turn off other distractions because I promise you these three women will keep you engaged in this conversation. So I'm just going to go ahead and jump in. So I know Diane gave a wonderful introduction of each of your backgrounds to help us get to know you a little bit better, but I'm really interested in getting to know the you. So if you wouldn't mind, if you would just share a little bit more about yourself, what you think is important for now, and more about your work at your respective organizations. So I'll turn it over to the panelists, whoever wants to go first.
I'll go because I don't really like talking about myself, so I'll be short and sweet. So I'm Jennifer Leith. I'm currently the executive director of the Douty Foundation. I think the description that Diane was reading is accurate. I've spent my professional career in the nonprofit world and have been, in many ways fortunate to sit in this seat as executive director of a foundation for the last 10 years. It's been an interesting perspective and network to be a part of. we are sort of in this odd space, I guess you could say, where the foundation itself is dissolving. We will no longer be a foundation at the end of this calendar year, which hopefully we'll be able to go into a little bit more. But a little bit about me. I was born and raised in Philadelphia. I don't know what else to say. I think that, as we continue the conversation, we'll probably draw a little bit more out about our perspectives. I've always been drawn to issues of sort of gender justice and working in that space in different ways, and always sort of like in whatever capacity that I'm working in and doing it, professionally and personally, sort of amplifying the voice of women and girls. So, I'm thrilled to be here today to talk a little bit more about that intersection with grant making and how we can kind of plot a more equitable future here in the Philadelphia region when it comes to providing resources to organizations and movements that matter. So I'm going to cut myself off right now. I'm going to hand it off to Farrah. How about that? Do you like what I did just there?
I saw that. Good job, Jen. Hi, everyone. I am excited to be here. I'm particularly excited to be here with Jen and Elicia, who are really amazing people and who I am proud to call co-conspirators. We have, both spent time thinking about how we can disrupt, usurp, make change. And so I feel like I'm in very good company. About me, so I've been at Gender Justice Fund for going on 1.5 years. When I got there, we were known as New Century Trust. And so we had a big name change last year. That was kind of a big deal. And as Diane said in her introduction, gender justice has always been a really strong passion of mine, though this is really my first gig that's focused on gender. And they say when you do what you're passionate about, you don't work a day in your life. And I'm here to tell you that that is not true. It's definitely a lot of work, but I also do it with, I get more joy out of it. What else about me? I grew up in Jamaica, West Indies, not Jamaica, New York. And it was there actually that somehow instinctively I got some of my first lessons about misogyny and gender roles and ideas about how the kind of world I did not or did want to be a part of. And I'm excited to be continuing this work and being in just the company of really good people doing this work. And now I'll turn it over to Alicia because Jen started the trend.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, so I do feel deeply honored to be here. And I also just want to lift up that one of the things I love about our people is that we support one another and we figure out how to network. And we, like, once we're connected and have a similar politic and outlook on life, I feel like it's just, we're unstoppable. So I think today's topic is on point. What I do is I'm the executive director of WMF. We are about to change our name that to something that's more gender inclusive. So I just want to lift that up and name that. And abortion really is at the epicenter of economic insecurity and all of the issues that Diane pointed out, which are making this gloomy day just all the more gloomy. But I also feel hopeful, or else I wouldn't be in this work, right? Like, I feel hopeful that we're right. I feel hopeful that we can win, and that really, truly, together we can make magic happen. And we can't do that without the solidarity of networks. And so I would be remiss if I didn't lift up that WMF is supported by Women's Way. We're also supported by Gender Justice Fund. We're also supported by Douty Fund. So, like, we need to support each other's work in big and small ways, right? Like, this is how foundations show up for the work in real long lasting kind of ways. So just to put that out there. So WMF's been around, like Diane said, since 1985. We started off because there is a continued racist amendment law, I should say, that says that anybody who's on Medicaid can't use their insurance to cover the cost of an abortion. And so our folks recognized that that was going to hit hardest poor people, Black and brown folks, right? And so they just started to raise money from their friends, right? Again, how we do, we reach out to our friends, we're like, I need your help. Coming together and raise money and gave it out to folks who needed help with abortions. And we've been doing that since that time. A few years ago, we expanded into doing also community organizing, recognizing that we really need to center this work on communities most impacted, and that this work must be led by folks who are the most at the epicenter of abortion injustice. And so we've been doing that work. I came into this work, I'm originally from Colorado, from Denver, so DU, cute little spot. My philosophy has evolved for sure since that time, as I hope all of ours has. I come into this work from a pretty specific bodily autonomy perspective, like nobody should tell anybody what to do with our bodies, and have since recognized just how on purpose abortion restrictions and economic insecurities are in this nation, and how they really are rooted in this on purpose white supremacist capitalist system. So looking forward to talking with you about all that.
Great, thank you. You know, I think starting off with kind of level setting with folks and figuring out from each of you what you mean when you talk about the word equity. I think it comes up a lot today, and I think each of you have kind of mentioned it in your remarks. And I would love to kind of hear your perspective on what do you mean by equity? What does that look like for you? And lastly, what role can Philanthropy Network play in that? Who wants to go first?
You want to go ahead, Jen? You can go.
It's like, wait, she pushed her mute button off first. You go first.
Okay. Well, I mean, I was going to say we've all, but I guess we haven't all probably seen this visual, but there's a very popular sort of visual that compares equity and equality. And it's three people trying to see a game over a fence. And they're all different heights. And so two of the people can't really see, and one person is tall and can see, and equality is giving them all a box at the same height. So the shortest person still can't see on the box. The middle person can see, and the tallest person can see even better than they could before. And equity, in that the meme is defined as giving the shortest person the tallest box, right? So that they can see everybody's on the same playing field. So, in very basic terms, equity is sort of about giving resources where they are most needed. But I think, beyond equity, there's another version of that meme that says liberation, and there's just no fence. And I think that, what we're hoping, at Gender Justice Fund are hoping to work towards is a place where there is not the need to make corrections, in a world where everybody has what they need, the freedom and the resources to make the lives that they want for themselves. So it's about access, it's about rights, but it's also about resources. And I think that's sort of the perspective from which we get to equity. So it's focusing on the places where people are most marginalized and directing resources there, so that, you lift from the bottom, really. The trickle-down economics has proven again and again and again and again and again that it does not work. And so that's kind of the approach that we take. Jen?
Yeah, I mean, you've said that obviously quite well. So I don't feel the need to add anything. I think that, you know, just to sort of put a little ... is just, you know, acknowledging that there are, I guess, like, my mind always goes to, like, why does the world exist in the way that it exists? And it always goes, and this is just me, it always goes to, like, politics and laws and what sort of rules have put in place to sort of prevent people from doing whatever, you know, needs to be done. So I think that equity is really acknowledging how any institution or system that you're involved with sort of advantages some people over others, and really, like, looking to recalibrate that to sort of address that inequity. So it can take place in any way. It doesn't have to be in, you know, a political sense, but you know, just sort of thinking about that the recalibration and how you as an individual plays a role in sort of like the outward manifestation of that institution or system that is sort of putting those fences, if, you know, to sort of tag on to Farrah's picture, you know, what we're doing as people to sort of keep those fences in place. So that's kind of how I look at equity, and sort of translate it into what I do and present myself in the world, but also through, you know, the work that we've done, you know, with the Douty Foundation.
Yes, and I'm so grateful that, Farrah, you brought up that image, specifically the one around liberation, because that's it really, in a nutshell. And to Jen's point about the fence being the system, the only other thing that I would add is just that fence is built on purpose to disadvantage certain folks. And so when we are moving through the world as individuals, as organizations, as philanthropic institutions, we have to think about, are we trying to take the fence down, or are we just adding more boxes, specifically to people who are already tall, which we know to be the case, right? Like, our society consistently gives boxes to people who are tall. And if the box is a little bit not the same size, and all of a sudden it's like reverse racism and all the things. So yeah, everything that's been said, for sure.
Great, thanks. And yeah, so I'm curious to dig more into that. So how are you guys working in each of your respective organizations to kind of to break these fences, and how do you go about it within the structure that already exists, or do you have to go around the structure or create a new structure?
I can start off a little bit. Jen, I'll give you a little bit of a breakdown. So we're doing a little bit of a both and approach at WMF. So we are doing the direct service work to ensure that folks get care right now, today, because literally we just, we talk to over 3,000 people and give out money. So there's not really time for us to think about a long-term strategy when people need care today. And then I'm glad that you mentioned this idea about coming up with alternative systems and alternative solutions, right? So it's not just enough to build or to take that fence down. It's not just enough to kind of like burn it all down without there being other systems in place to ensure that our communities are cared for. So one of the things that we're trying to do is to think about how to create a wraparound kind of care for community, like holistic care for community that lives beyond just the transaction of giving somebody money. So what else do folks need? Most of the people who call our helpline, like 74%, are parenting at least one child at home, deep poverty, $8,000 a year annual salary. So we're looking at, can we create a collective of support amongst people who've had abortions, providing additional resources, providing emotional support. Abortion obviously is highly stigmatized. So providing and combating the systemic, mostly white supremacist system that says abortion is wrong, and creating systems that says abortion is right, abortion is healthy, abortion is normal. We will help you grieve, we will help you celebrate, and we will help you take care of yourself and your families. That's what we're doing.
Shira, I'm going to ask you to repeat the question. I am so sorry. I got lost in Alicia's response.
Yeah, I know. Don't worry, I got the same. So just kind of talking about how you are actually working to break that fence down. And I mean, particularly for you, right? Like in the philanthropic space, we know that wealth is in the hands of of a few. And we keep saying that we're spreading the wealth and we're changing, but how have we actually done that? And are we doing that within the same within the structures that currently exist, or are we going beyond those? And if so, how are you doing that?
Okay, so I'll start off by saying that, Gender Justice Fund is a private foundation, and we're not a family foundation, and none of the people whose money is in our endowment are still alive, but that money probably came on the backs of, some sort of exploitation or suffering or something like that. And we are very aware of that. And so one of the things that we do is, I guess we're tackling this in two ways. One is in the kinds of things we fund. So in terms of trying to get rid of the fence. So our biggest grant program is our systems change grant program, where we are really trying to fund organizations that are trying to make change through policy advocacy or community organizing. So, among the groups we fund are the Philadelphia Domestic Workers Alliance, who got past one of the strongest domestic worker bill of rights in the US. And so that's changing the playing field, as it were, for domestic workers. We fund a lot of people who do labor organizing. We fund Women's Medical Fund for their advocacy work. So we're really focused on trying to change laws, trying to change circumstances. And then we are also trying to, as far as we can, and we can certainly do more and are pushing ourselves to do more, to change the power dynamics around who makes decisions about funding. And so we have started experimenting with what's typically called participatory grant-making. We earlier this year did a special fund for the trans community that the Douty Foundation supported. And we brought together a pool of folks from the local trans community. We compensated them for their time, and they helped come up with the criteria. They read the proposals, they interviewed the applicants, and they made the grant decisions. And so putting the power to decide, where these funds went within that community, we put it really squarely in their hands. And we're thinking about ways that we can do that with all our grant making. It is quite labor intensive. And so there is that. But those are some of the things that we are working on.
Thanks, that's really helpful. Jen, any thoughts from the Douty Foundation on ways that you guys are kind of breaking down those fences and either working within the system or finding ways outside the system, perhaps?
Yeah, thanks for that. I think it just philosophically, like the Douty Foundation has been around for a little over 50 years, and you talk about mission statements and value statements and da-da-da. So we've always believed and funded, grassroots organizations that were really rooted in their community, because we really believe that the people closest to a challenge or are closest to sort of like the solution, whatever that may be. So it's really about like movement building. So, we've always done that in supporting really small but scrappy, organizing work and advocacy work, but, a little bit of direct services too in there, which has been, wonderful. And philanthropy is so interesting because you have these people who create foundations. They're wealthy enough to sort of like earmark away millions of dollars to support organizations and efforts that they feel, need to be given resources. So when the Douty Foundation reached its 50th anniversary, which was in 2018, I sort of like worked with the board to say, this is what we've been doing over 50 years. Like, do we want to continue doing this? Does this make sense? You know, it is a private foundation. It's not a family foundation. So there was no family that was really like the Doughtys themselves. So, you know, it was sort of like an inflection point or reflection point to say, like, we're doing this work, but is there a way that we could do it differently? And our board sort of was open to that idea of, like, you know, maybe we should be thinking about doing stuff a little bit differently. But we knew that, you know, we're a modest, you know, sized asset foundation. Like, how could we sort of like amplify and accelerate the work that we've been supporting, work like, you know, the Women's Medical Fund, the Domestic Workers Alliance, and all different, you know, kinds of organizations that are doing really good stuff in our community. So, you know, it was sort of like an opportunity to reflect on, do we have to do philanthropy the way that it's always been done for the past 50 years, or could we do things a little bit differently and kind of think about what is more of a longer term vision, right? So our board, you know, really thought that maybe we should think about not even existing anymore. Like, is there a way that our assets and our resources could be sort of joined together to create a more magnified resources for the work that we've always supported? So, you know, our board worked through that over like the last, I guess, 3 years, and sprinkled in there was, you know, the pandemic and some efforts where we were able to put resources on the ground immediately, but also think about, like, how can we support these efforts and the movements that, you know, we're supporting now moving forward. And so we did a lot of participatory grant making, not directly through us, but through efforts like the Trans Resilience Fund, and there's some other, you know, PA is Ready was really like the first participatory grant making effort that we were able to put resources into. And as we kind of were thinking about this dissolution process and not existing as a private foundation anymore, really putting for us, you know, larger amounts of resources into that. And with that is really, you know, sort of a loss of control, which I have to commend to my board for recognizing that, you know, you're letting go of really the decision making about where the resources are going. You're putting it in the hands of those that are, you know, closest to the issues that you're looking to support. So, you know, I think the Douty Foundation is doing what was right for the Douty Foundation, and the board was really courageous in doing that. And it would be wonderful to see other funders that sort of take that step and really think about how they can sort of loosen their own control over the decisions where their funds are made. So, you know, with the Douty Foundation, it's sort of been an evolution to this dissolution process. And, you know, our assets will live on with the Bread and Roses Community Fund. So I think that is, you know, really a wonderful way that sort of aligns the interests of the foundation. But we as the board, and me, this random person who's been selected as the executive director, aren't making these decisions anymore. You know, that we're putting it into the hands of the communities that are directly affected by the work that needs to happen, because the work that needed to happen 50 years ago in some ways is different than the work that needs to happen now. But sadly, in some ways, it is the same work that needs to happen. So, that's sort of, you know, our sort of 360-degree view and high level overview of where we've been and where we're going with regards to sort of, you know, breaking down those fences.
Great, thanks, Jen. And I think this idea of supporting movements is, you know, only one that I've only heard in the last few years come up in philanthropy. I think, you know, usually it was just, you know, one-off grant making and things of that nature. So it's exciting to see some of the foundations kind of following those footsteps. And Farrah, I'd love to pick up on some of what you were saying around your participatory funds, and kind of hear a little bit more about the impact of that fund and maybe some of the lessons that you've learned, if you've seen any, you know, kind of going back to the idea of what we're talking about today and closing, and I know it's closing the women's wealth gap, but have you have you been able to see from any of these participatory funds some of the closing of any of those wealth gaps?
Closing, maybe diminishing. I mean, the wealth gaps are huge, right? But one of the things that was very clear when we got together this committee of trans folks and said, what do we want to focus on? And the resounding answer was putting money in trans people's pockets. And so the focus of the grant making was really on giving the money to organizations that would help trans folks meet basic needs, because unfortunately, due to discrimination and a lot of, trans folks are more likely to be homeless, kicked out of their homes, discriminated against at work, and any number of things. There's just a high poverty rate, high housing insecurity. And folks on the committee knew that and understood that and thought that was really important. And so that's where a lot of the money went. And, one of the, I was going to say good things. One of the things that the pandemic has prompted, I guess it's a good thing that's come out of the pandemic, but I would rather not have had the pandemic, just to be clear. But I think funders are more willing to talk about just giving money to people. And so one of the things that Jennifer didn't mention that Douty did, but which I think was a game changer, was they gave at least $500,000 to some local groups that then passed it on to undocumented immigrants who were unable to get stimulus money. Like, people just got money in their pockets. And I think the idea of philanthropy really moving to just like literally redistributing wealth is powerful. And I think more philanthropy is getting more comfortable with that idea. I think people have always felt like, well, you need to give them services. We know what's best for them. We need to give them this kind of housing and we need to give them that kind of thing. And really, when you give people, we've seen examples overseas when people have universal basic income, they are able to make decisions that get them out of homelessness, that get them, much more stabilized. And so, that's one of the things that, I was already sort of on my radar, but just came home very clearly through that process where people are like, folks need money, people need to survive, and that's what we need. And direct services are great and all of that, no, we're not knocking service providers, but, folks need to pay bills, folks need to have food, folks need to have just the ability to do those things, and just redistributing wealth that way. Jennifer, were you going to add something? I saw you on mute.
No, I agree with you. I think it's, the pandemic is a perfect example of, philanthropy, wanted to step in and do something, and it did in many ways. There were a lot of efforts to provide food resources to people who didn't have them because they were out of work. And that was really like, I think the one thing that I just remember, but it's like, you have to think a little bit deeper. People like, why do people need food? Like, because they're not working anymore. Like, maybe they don't need, maybe they need cash. Like people can determine their own, way through life. And I think that in particular, the I can't remember the name of it, but it was providing direct cash assistance to folks who were left out of federal government stimulus programs, the Worker Relief Fund for Philadelphia, and then there was one that was throughout the state for undocumented folks, so that we were able to support. And I guess, going back where my mind always kind of goes is like, well, can we take this a little bit further? Like, can there be a policy change that are people really elected officials? Are they reflecting on this? Are they thinking about this? Like, why did they not want to provide this support to all people as opposed to just certain people? So I think that philanthropy, it can act nimble, and it does have the power to use its resources pretty much any way that it wants to. So, providing in this example, cash assistance directly to people was able to then, allow the city of Philadelphia to look at universal basic income, and is that a viable thing, a policy objective for the city, which then propelled the mayor to join. There's a group of mayors throughout the country that is looking at universal basic income. So one effort can sort of magnify itself and then lead to larger efforts that will ultimately sort of break those systems down that are kind of preventing people from living, their lives fully and making decisions and determining their own fate. So thanks for pointing that out, Farrah. I just was nodding in recognition. So thank you.
Yeah.
Great. And, I think, Jen, you brought up a couple times this theme of advocacy that keeps coming up. And I'm curious to hear more if each of you have an opinion on this, of how each of you feel about how you've been involved in advocacy efforts over the last few years, or particularly due to COVID, and how any of these efforts might have helped you achieve your goals.
I'll go. So it turns out that foundations, funnily enough, are more restricted than your average nonprofit in terms of advocacy. So, a 501c3 public charity like WMF that Alicia runs, they can't endorse political candidates, and they can't sort of embrace certain parties, but they can say, call your senator about Senate Bill number 245 because it's bad for whatever. Turns out we can't say that. Foundations cannot do any sort of legislative work, but that said, we can support organizations that are doing that, and we can be part of groups that are that use legislative interventions as one aspect of their work. So one of the things that we also fund at Gender Justice Fund is we have a culture change initiative, and that's really looking at sort of dismantling misogyny and rape culture. And we're currently funding some groups that do consent education. And through that work, we got involved with the PA Coalition for Sex Ed that Women's Medical Fund is also a part of. And so Alicia can talk a little more about that, because I don't know what all the legislative stuff is because I haven't been involved with that. But the idea is to promote comprehensive sex ed across Pennsylvania. There's a legislative angle to that, yes, but there's also providing public education. Last fall, they had a series of workshops that were really well attended and really awesome. And some of my grantees presented and they were great. So we are able to support, we helped underwrite some of those workshops. So there are ways to do it without, crossing the lines. There's a really great organization called Boulder Advocacy. I think they're in New York or DC, but basically they help nonprofits figure out where the lines are. And I have just cold called them and said, can I do X? Can I do Y? And they'll tell you. It's really great. And so we are really able to figure out how we can support the work without, while staying within legal limits. And I think it's important for philanthropy to really understand what's going on in the advocacy space, because it helps you make better decisions. And it helps you sort of understand the connections between the groups that you're funding, how this set of work relates to another set of work. Sort of, Jen was talking about how supporting that the Worker Relief Fund, is connected to Mayor Kenney becoming part of this set of organizations looking at UBI and like what other things might be coming down the pike. One of the things that some of the organizations that I fund were really into was making sure that the Department of Labor within the mayor's office became a permanent office so that they could have better labor protections, because most low-wage workers are women. And so it's mostly women that benefit from having this office. And so being able to understand, what the implications are of different policy decisions, different legislative decisions, I think helps you make much more informed decisions about what to support.
And I'll say the angle that we take at WMF is kind of the way that we were founded, is that folks came together to develop a non-state solution strategy, right? Like when the law went into effect in Pennsylvania, folks could have said, we're going to try to encourage our legislators to overturn this, but they knew that doing so is going to take some time. Here we are 36 years later. So we like this idea of reminding people and giving people permission, like helping people feel fired up about this idea that like the state is not here to save us. And so we have to have solutions that exist outside of that. And so we, for example, we do push the envelope sometimes, I think, with folks and ruffle some feathers, which to me, I think is an indication that something is working usually. And so, for example, we're really trying to challenge, we're about to, in a different kind of way, I shouldn't say we've been as vocal as we're about to be, but we're trying to push back against the medical industrial complex, right? We talked about these fences. Sometimes those fences look really pretty, right? Like healthcare system and like doctors and abortion providers, even like it looks important, it looks great. And all love and all respect to abortion providers. They are doing God's work for real. And also there's harm caused in lifting up the message that anything that exists outside of a clinic is bad and harmful. Abortions have happened from the beginning of time. They've happened in communities, they've happened in homes. And so we're really trying to lift up this idea that just because something is not legal does not make it automatically unsafe, which is not a popular opinion. But we have to reframe our brain into thinking about the fact that abortions have gone on outside of the law for some time. And I'm going to drop in the chat a link to a book that if everybody or anybody wants to read it, to just remember the kind of like badassery and organizing and outside of systems, outside of the box kind of thinking that folks have done. Before Roe v. Wade was the law of the land, there was a group in Chicago called Jane. It wasn't like, they don't really like to call themselves a collective, but they provided abortions, like regular schmegular women, regular schmegular housewives. Once they learned that the person they were sending their folks to was not an actual licensed medical provider, they're like, well, if he can do it, why can't we do it, right? When we had the author come and talk to an audience about this practice, literally people were like, oh, what do you mean? Like you were breaking the law? And the woman who's the author of this book, she's, I think, in her 70s now, I want to say, little powerhouse firecracker, was like, unjust laws are meant to be broken. So we just carry that energy and fire with us in thinking through, like, how do we think of systems and breaking them down in such a way that reminds people of like, none of this is normal, right? Abortions happen outside of the medical institution way longer than they've existed within the medical institution. So that's sort of our lane, if you will.
Great, thank you. Jen, do you have anything to add to that? No worries if not.
No, I guess it just like goes like what I think about is, why does the Women's Medical Fund need to exist in Pennsylvania? It needs to exist because some cisgendered white man decided in 1989 to make this law that's going to, regulate what pregnant people can do with their bodies. And it's so, like working around is needed and necessary. But I guess I always just want to like break through and be like, well, I guess we wouldn't maybe have a law like that, perhaps if we had more women in office, or we wouldn't, be talking about the gender wealth gap if we had more elected officials who reflected, 50% or 50% plus of, the population of Pennsylvania or the United States, or, so I feel like we're like all working in this system that was like created in many ways by people, who have had the power for 400 years. And it's like time to just like take that power away and sort of, looking at grant makers, because that's what our topic is, like grant, equity and grant making is, just hopefully people are reflecting on you don't always have to keep doing things the same way, just because it's always been done that way, or because the law says you have to, like that 5% rule. It's like, okay, sure, yeah, you have to give away, 5%, but you could do more, so not really. I'm just sort of rambling at this point.
Can I say just one like small reaction to Jen, because I agree and I hear you and I support different folks being in positions of power and authority. I also just want to name that representation doesn't necessarily mean actually advancing liberation, Susan Collins, because if the person who's in charge is a woman, a cisgender woman, and is really internalized white supremacy, internalized patriarchy, internalized capitalism, then we go nowhere, right? If it's not value aligned, if it's not somebody who shares a similar worldview towards liberation, then representation means nothing.
I get you on that. I get it.
Yep.
Yeah, I just put in the chat Betsy DeVos.
Yeah, there's people that could be named in Pennsylvania. Yeah, so.
Yeah. And I think that kind of goes into my next question. And again, for folks that are listening, feel free to start putting your questions in Q&A. I'll start kind of looking at that list in a second. And, but so why, given Diane's presentation at the beginning too, and just kind of seeing that these gaps are not diminishing, but only getting larger, how do you think, or why do you think we're not actually moving the needle?
Define we.
So we can be, philanthropy as an organization or as an entity, could be, nonprofits in general, us as individuals.
Well, I think one of the important things to know about wealth is that the wealth disparities in general in this country have increased significantly in recent years. And so, women and people of color are hardest hit by that. I think when you also think about where this country has chosen to invest resources, there's a lot of money for war. There's billions for war, and we don't have universal childcare, which, is one of the, I think, the most important reasons why women are not able to return to the workforce as quickly after this pandemic, because the childcare sector has been decimated. And also people who work in childcare tend to be women, and they're grossly underpaid. And that whole sector just really needs the kind of significant government investment like it has in other countries, and it's not there. So I think underpinning, I'm sure there's more philanthropy could do, nonprofits. I'm not going to lay this at any nonprofit's feet. Philanthropy is certainly sitting on a lot of money that could be put out there. But I also think, when you think about what has allowed people to amass the kind of wealth that they're able to do, the kind of philanthropy that they do, Mackenzie Scott has given away a ton of money, and she's still, I read, richer than she was at the start of the pandemic, because that's just how the economy works, and the tax, the way the tax system is set up, she's able to keep a lot of that. And so I think it's structural, right? A lot of it is the fence. And then the way that, things shake out, women, trans and non-binary people, people of color, disabled people. I mean, the rules around how much wealth disabled people can amass and keep. Disabled people have a hard time getting married because they'll lose their benefits, and all of that kind of stuff. A lot of it is structural. A lot of it is about policies that have been enacted over the years, I think.
What do you all think about how philanthropy, so we, support organizations, and then, you give the $5,000 and the $10,000 grants, and you look at the budget, and then you see, the people working at the organization are making very low wages, like the perpetuation of the fact that a lot of, the nonprofit sector seems to attract a lot of, people who identify as women. And I think that, we have to sort of think about, like, how does philanthropy sort of perpetuate that sort of like massive underfunding, whether it's massive underfunding around the issue or the work that the nonprofits have doing, but also the people that are, working within the walls of that organization. And, is there a retirement benefit? Like, is there healthcare? Is there childcare? Like, I've never worked at an organization. I'll be honest with you, I've never worked part-time over the last like less than 20 years, but I haven't had a defined retirement plan. How's that? Like, that's kind of wild, right? Like, I haven't had healthcare. I have healthcare, but it's not through my employer. Like, I think we really need to think and examine how this is all sort of like happening around us, and how we can all sort of like work together to make it stop, and make sure that everybody has resources to be in the moment and living and caring for the people around them, but also, later in life. And so it's just something that always I sort of come back to, in philanthropy, and just the different organizations that are doing really good work, and how workers are being compensated for that work. And is it fair, and is it just? And often no. And philanthropy, needs to sort of own up to that and do something about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'll just say one quick thing. One is that I really appreciate organizations and foundations that aren't so nitpicky about overhead, because they're like, we just want to fund programs, we don't want to fund personnel. I'm like, who do you think's doing the work? Like, this isn't Willy Wonka factory. Well, Oompa Loompas are people. Let me take that back. But I think, really leaning into this idea of not only just wage equity, but wage parity. So we've been looking at that at WMF a lot. Like, why am I making more money than other people? I carry a different amount of burden, but do I carry less of a burden than people who have to listen on the helpline every day and tell people, no, we don't have any more money? Like, I don't know. So WMF, we've been trying to do this in a very upfront kind of way. We've gone down to a 4-day work week. We have increased, everybody got raises and is continuing to get raises. We took a week off, like just a hiatus to hit pause, because we still are in this pandemic and everybody's acting like this is normal, and we were exhausted and we continue to be exhausted. So we just shut down and just figured out a way to get our callers still got the money that they needed to get that week. But we're looking really long and hard at, parental leave, at childcare subsidies, at wellness subsidies, and like ensuring that folks are taken care of as a whole person.
Yeah, that's also something that we're looking at. And, I think there's a certain level of martyrdom that we like to embrace, or maybe that's just me, but, right now I'm the only staff member at Gender Justice Fund, and I'm like, oh, my healthcare's covered, it's fine. I wasn't thinking about other benefits, and now I'm going to be hiring somebody, and suddenly I'm like, no, if this person comes, I want them to be able to have this and that and that and that. And the board is very supportive, and it's just that we haven't spent the time, and we are so focused on doing the work. But I think Elicia raises a good point, which is how you're doing the work matters too, and how you're treating the people doing the work, and how we take care of ourselves and of each other is important too. And that is part of the struggle, I think, too. Creating safer spaces, creating spaces where people can survive and thrive, and really being committed to that as we do this work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. All good things to think about, and hopefully people are thinking about that in their own practices as well. I think obviously COVID has put brought it to the forefront in the sense of, how are we taking care of our mental health in general? So again, one of the unintended consequences that could be good for the future. I want to turn it over to a question that we received from Connie around, does achieving equity require identifying and working with women-led funds? Any thoughts on that?
I don't know if I understand exactly what that, the women-led funds, meaning women are making the decisions about where the fund, you know, the resources are being placed, or I'm sure you don't either because it was in the chat. So
that is, I think that makes sense though, in terms of like, you know, the participatory funds that are women-led rather than like women-led organizations that are putting together participatory funds. So
oh, it depends, I guess, for me. I mean, I know there is one, it's there's one locally that it's mostly women that, you know, pool their resources and then make determination on where those funds go. So I really think it's not just because it has a more woman in it. I think it needs to sort of, you have to know what exactly the details are on what how they're doing it, how they're doing their decision making, you know, that at least for me, I don't know, but I'd need a little more information before I answer that.
I think it goes back to Alicia's point about representation. And so you want organizations that are representative of the populations that are most affected. But again, just because somebody is female doesn't necessarily mean that they represent the best interests of women or of trans or non-binary people. Again, Betsy DeVos. I mean, she really decimated Title IX. And so I think what's important is to collaborate with organizations that are really truly committed to achieving liberation, to centering those most affected, to racial justice, to gender justice, to disability justice, to reproductive justice. It's really about the stances they take and the values they embrace. Representation matters, but it is not everything.
yeah. And so just kind of curious too on why, and if you even agree with this, is why, and I know Diane kind of mentioned some of these points at the beginning of her presentation, but why investing in women is important, women and racial justice. Any thoughts on that?
I'm going to admit to not knowing exactly how to interpret investing in women.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. And well, I think to your point too, like you said at the beginning too, is it, you know, putting cash in people's hands it sounded like you had found that putting cash in women's hands or putting cash in individuals' hands in general was a really powerful way to actually make a difference. So I guess it's investing in several different, it could be investing in several different ways. It's, you know, putting cash in hands, it's putting power in people's hands. It's, you know, changing the power dynamics in general so they do have power. All right.
Well, I certainly think it's important to put power in the hands of folks who have not historically had it, i.e. women. But I also think just when you mentioned the cash thing, one of the things that crossed my mind, which I'm sure you probably saw when you were doing development work, is one of the things that, you know, has become sort of very well known in folks who are doing work in developing countries is that when you give resources to families, it's, if you want to make the whole family better off, you're better off giving the money to the woman because she's going to make sure everybody has food and healthcare, and that the neighbor, has something to eat and all of that. And, not all men, but in general, men were less likely to do that. They were more likely to spend the money on themselves. And I will say, though, that, one of the things that, while that analogy is true and there's nothing inherently wrong with that, I struggle with the idea that it's good to invest in women because they take care of everybody else. Women are valuable in and of themselves and should be able to have what they need because they are humans and they deserve it. So I'll just put that out there too.
Yeah, that makes sense. And yes, I definitely saw that in my years of international work. So I guess for each of you, I'm just kind of curious about, action steps. Like, what can people on this call take from this? So like, where do we go from here? What are foundations that some of the steps that foundations on this call, nonprofits or individuals can take to address some of the structural systematic causes of gender and racial inequalities? Just as a, small question.
Did you say just as a small question?
I can start. I always like to think about it in like a micro and then macro way. And I'll only address the micro because I think some of the macro has been addressed. But in terms of thinking about, again, the reference that Farrah made earlier around the fences, we each have an obligation in this society to think about ways in which we are continuing to add wood to that fence, and or not even acknowledging the ways that we're benefiting from that fence, right? And so I encourage everybody, specifically non-Black people of color and white folks on this call, to interrogate the way that we perpetuate white supremacy and anti-Blackness, and like actually put in work and support Black authors, go to trainings that are offered by Black folks, invest in communities. Like, I did a book that was one of the hardest books I've ever like read and done. It's not a book you just read, you actually do this job, Mean and White Supremacy, which I can't speak highly enough, but like put in work to think about the ways that you're taking advantage of these systems that are putting other folks in harm's way.
Mm-hmm. Great. We had another question come into the chat on any thoughts on partnering, working with community-led financial institutions like CDFIs and credit unions or community banks in bridging the gender wealth gap?
Well, I think that from the perspective of like philanthropy and grant making, I think that, you have that 5% that you're supposed to give out in grants or donor advised funds. And then you have that 95% of your assets that are sitting there. I think that a really wonderful way to put them to work within your own community is to invest some or all of it in like a community development finance institution that is using those resources to support small businesses and local entrepreneurs who hopefully are, underrepresented, in the banking industry. They're not able to, businesses and business owners probably, Black women and women of color, just people who have just been disproportionately sort of kept out of mainstream financial institutions. That's where CDFIs come in. So I think that's like low hanging fruit to do, something that's called impact investing in philanthropy, which is really wonderful. I mean, there's a number of CDFIs locally that are doing really good stuff. So I think that's one tool, as somebody in philanthropy would often use the tools in her toolbox, Laura McKenna. That is a tool that can help, maybe narrow the gender wealth gap in some ways, certainly around entrepreneurship and business ownership.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Jen. And so we have a few minutes remaining. Just want to make sure that there's any last thoughts that each of the panelists want to kind of leave today with, or things that weren't asked that you want to make sure that other people understand or hear today.
I just hope that funders, it seemed like there was great momentum, tremendous momentum last summer. We're still in the pandemic, but also around a lot of the social uprisings that were happening throughout the country. And I really felt like philanthropy was doing a lot of good introspection, but I think that, that's sort of, it's not happening as much anymore. And I really urge, colleagues in philanthropy to keep it's the long game, right? It's not like, okay, this is happening, this pandemic's happening, what are we going to do? But like examining why, who was affected by the pandemic. It was an economic and health pandemic, and how are they adjusting whatever they do in the work that they do, which is grant making. Making sure that they're bringing diverse voices to their board tables, but maybe even just creating their own participatory grant making thing within the decision making of that organization. I think, as Farrah said, it's hard and it's long and it's a lot of work, but it's really fruitful. And contributing to collective and pooled efforts is sort of like an easy sort of low hanging fruit. Like there's usually Farrah did all the work for the Trans Resilience Fund. Like all we had to do was provide the funding for it. It doesn't get easier than that to do really good stuff with the resources that you have. And also don't stick to the rules. Like, why do you have to give 5%? What about 10? I mean, the market's doing incredible and people are still sticking with these, usual ways of thinking of doing things. And if we continue to do that, then we're just going to be stuck with the usual way of things happening around us. And I think that hope that was sort of happening in philanthropy about 10 months ago is sort of dissipating now, I think, because people aren't talking about this stuff anymore. And I hope that they will. And reach out to Farrah and Alicia. I'm sure they got a lot of ideas for you.
Yeah, I just like to echo what Jen is saying. Folks are seeming to want to go back to business as usual. And the truth of the matter is business as usual never worked for a whole set of people. And in the ways, we saw philanthropy really respond in wild ways. Like they were just giving people money without requiring grant proposals and, making longer term grants and reaching out to people to give emergency funds and really rethinking, going outside, the box. And one of the things that Sydney, who is Shira's predecessor, always said was, there's not actually that many rules for foundations. And he's right, the tax forms are annoying, but there are not actually that many rules. And there is a lot of flexibility and this affinity for doing what's always been done and following these unspoken rules. I mean, those are hallmarks of white supremacy. And so one of the things I just encourage people to do is being willing to just break free of that and recognize that just because that's what you've always done or what everybody else does, that's not really necessary. And the other thing is to do something, right? You can't do all the things, right? We give out more than 5% this year. I think we're going to be giving out 8 or 9%, but we're not spending down, and that's not. We sort of see ways that we can be of value for a little bit longer. And we're also going to be discussing that in a strategic plan. So like the idea, not everybody has to engage in every solution, right? So Douty felt it made sense to sort of spend down, and certainly all the foundations should be spending more money, especially the really large ones. As foundations go, Douty and us, we're pretty small, but there are foundations with a lot more funds that could really afford to spend a lot more money. So do that, or do participatory grant making, or, you know, do something, right? I think it's easy to just be like, oh, it's too much and not do anything at all. And that's a luxury that you just don't have, right? So, yeah.
Yeah, and just in terms of like, as a grantee who gets money from the foundations that are here, we love and appreciate multi-year grants, general operating support, really easy grant applications. I would love to have a grant report just that's absorbed into the grant application, because I end up writing the grant report and then repeating myself again on the grant application. So those should just be the same thing, or just doing away with it altogether and let's just have a phone call. I don't think that could ever work, but like, why not if we're dreaming? Thinking of other ways that folks can apply for funding. There was I can't think of the name of it right now, but there was a funder who one of their ways of people applying was through a video. Like, you don't even have to have anything in writing. That was wild. I never, like, it kind of scared me, to be honest. But just like, again, like thinking outside of the box of like not what things have always been done. Like, what are ways that we actually make this accessible? You know, some people are better at articulating their story face to face or through verbal communication than they are in writing, taking that into account. And then just really quickly on an individual basis. And I think collectively too, this scarcity mentality that we're somehow going to do without if somebody else has more is such a product of white supremacy that we all need to get in touch with. And it's like this deep-seated fear in our belly, fear of giving up control, fear of not having money, like all of these things. And I think once we recognize that our liberation is actually connected and that I'm only able to be fully human if other people are free, then we can get there.
On mute. Thank you for those great last words and thoughts. I will turn it over to Diane to close us out.
Thank you, all of you. Alicia, that was a great last words, actually, because our liberation is found with each other. And I just want to thank Farrah, Jen, Alicia, and Shira for having this conversation, which is very important. I think one of the key takeaways is that we want to dismantle the fence, which is a system of white supremacy, which is really a hierarchy of racialized value in order to disconnect and divide us from each other. And I think, you know, when people say that, this seems so overwhelming, but you just heard there's concrete things that each of us can do, and we can all take our part. And I do want to also emphasize that we are the system, all of us. And doing that internal work that Elicia says, particularly for white people, to start looking at our own internalized white supremacy, it has to start within our own mental models. And then that could be a ripple effect and get others to start doing that work. So yes, let's dismantle this fence of white supremacy, right? Let's build a new system that is based on compassion and love and solidarity, right? And that there's abundance. It's filled with abundance of love. There's enough. So thank you all for all this. We will be sharing this. This is recorded. We will be sharing this on our website, and we will be sharing all the resources that Alicia and other folks have given. And we also have some other resources and great article books and models of things like participatory grant making and other ways to really promote equity through grant making. So thank you so much for coming. Our next one's on October 19th, looking at the intersections of intimate partner violence and economic security of women. So thank you. Good night. Enjoy the rest of your evening. And thank you all again. Bye-bye.